In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front of the Second World War entered a decisive phase. The German Wehrmacht, after launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, had advanced deep into Soviet territory but failed to achieve the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union that its planners had envisioned. The previous year had seen catastrophic battles at Stalingrad and along the Volga, where the German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed. That defeat, coupled with Soviet offensives during the winter of 1942-1943, shifted the strategic balance. Yet Germany retained significant forces in the occupied Soviet territories, including the economically vital Donbas region, a center of coal, steel, and armaments production. Both Berlin and Moscow recognized that the outcome of operations in this area would shape the course of the war in Eastern Europe. The Donbass had been under German control since the summer of 1942, following Army Group South's drive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Its industrial resources were critical to sustaining the German war economy and were systematically exploited through occupation administration. Coal mining, metallurgical plants, and chemical industries were repurposed to support the Wehrmacht, though production often fell short due to destruction, sabotage, and labor shortages. For the Soviet Union, the loss of the Donbass meant not only a disruption of vital raw materials, but also the displacement of millions of civilians. Evacuations, scorched-earth policies, and occupation left the region scarred, and its liberation became both a military and symbolic objective for Soviet leadership. The wider geopolitical context added urgency. By mid-1943, Germany faced growing pressures on multiple fronts. In the Mediterranean, Allied forces had landed in Sicily, and Italy's capacity to remain in the Axis coalition was increasingly uncertain. In the Atlantic, submarine warfare no longer promised decisive results, and the Allied strategic bombing campaign was intensifying against German cities and industrial targets. On the Eastern Front, Adolf Hitler sought a renewed offensive to regain the initiative after Stalingrad. This ambition culminated in Operation Citadel, the German attack at Kursk in July 1943. Designed to encircle and destroy large Soviet forces through a pincer movement by the 9th Army from the north and the 4th Panzer Army, with Army Detachment Kempf from the south. However, the Soviet High Command, anticipating the assault, fortified the salient with extensive defensive belts and concentrated armored and artillery reserves. When Operation Citadel was launched on 5 July 1943, it quickly developed into one of the largest armored clashes of the war. German armored formations, including Tiger and Panther tanks, confronted Soviet T-34s and anti-tank defenses in a series of costly engagements. Despite localized advances, the Germans were unable to achieve a breakthrough. The climax came at Prokhorovka on 12th of July, where the TuZ SS Panzer Corps collided with the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army in a dense, chaotic battle. Though Soviet losses were heavy, German armored strength was also severely depleted. Meanwhile, Soviet forces on the flanks prepared counteroffensives under the codename Operation Kutuzov against the Orel salient and Operation Polkovodets, Rumyantsev toward Belgorod and Kharkov. By mid-July, Hitler ordered the suspension of Citadel, citing the Allied landings in Sicily and the deteriorating situation in the Mediterranean, effectively conceding the strategic initiative to the Red Army. This shift directly set the stage for operations in the Donbass. The Soviet Stavka recognized that the Wehrmacht's failure at Kursk left its southern front exposed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and other commanders emphasized the need to exploit German weakness by striking into the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine. The German Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, sought to stabilize the front and retain control of the Donbass, both for its resources and its position as a shield for the Dnieper line further west. Manstein advocated flexible defense and localized counterattacks, but he faced significant constraints. German divisions had suffered attrition at Kursk, reinforcements were limited, and the Luftwaffe struggled with fuel shortages and rising Allied air superiority. By contrast, the Red Army, benefiting from expanding production, increasing mechanization, and Allied Lend-Lease support, prepared to launch large-scale operations involving multiple fronts. For the civilian population of the Donbass, the anticipation of renewed fighting brought uncertainty. Many had already endured 2 years of harsh occupation, forced labor, and reprisals. Some cooperated with Soviet partisans or engaged in sabotage, while others were conscripted into German labor battalions. The looming battles threatened further destruction of towns, infrastructure, and livelihoods. Both sides viewed the population as strategically significant, Germany as a labor source, and the Soviet Union as citizens to be reclaimed and reintegrated after liberation. The prospect of combat across densely populated industrial zones raised the likelihood of heavy civilian casualties and widespread devastation. Thus, by late July and early August 1943, the Donbass stood at the intersection of broader military, political, and economic forces. Germany sought to preserve a defensive line that could protect its retreat toward the Dnieper, while the Soviet Union aimed not only to liberate lost territory, but also to cripple the Wehrmacht's capacity to resist further westward offensives. The impending struggle promised to be massive in scale, involving hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and an area whose strategic value made it central to both war economies. The events that unfolded would not only decide the fate of the Donbass, but also confirm the irreversible shift of momentum on the Eastern Front. On 13th of July 1943, as the German drive at Kursk faltered, the Soviet High Command initiated its counterstroke. The Western, Bryansk, and Central Fronts opened Operation Kutuzov against the Oral Salient, forcing German Ninth Army onto the defensive. Within days, the northern pincer of Citadel collapsed, and attention shifted southward, where Soviet forces prepared to strike at Belgorod and Kharkov in Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev. These offensives marked the transition from German attempts at regaining the initiative to a broad Soviet advance along the entire front. For the Donbass, this meant that Army Group South would soon face relentless pressure, with little opportunity to regroup or reorganize. The German command structure in the southern sector reflected both strength and fragility. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, controlled the 1st Panzer Army under General Oberst Eberhard von Mackensen, the 6th Army under General Karl Adolf Hollet, and parts of the 4th Panzer Army. These formations, stretched across the vast steppe, had endured high losses in men and materiel during Citadel. By August 1943, German armored divisions that once fielded over 150 tanks often had fewer than 50 operational vehicles. Infantry divisions frequently numbered 6,000, 8,000 men instead of their authorized 15,000. Despite these deficiencies, Manstein hoped to stabilize the front through counterblows and flexible withdrawals, preserving combat power while trading space for time. Opposing them, the Soviet command concentrated massive forces for the liberation of Ukraine. The Voronezh Front, led by General Nikolai Vatutin, and the Steppe Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, spearheaded the offensive toward Kharkov. Further south, the Southwestern Front under General Rodion Malinovsky and the Southern Front under General Fyodor Tolbukhin prepared to strike into the Donbas itself. In total, the Red Army deployed over 1 million men, supported by some 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and thousands of artillery pieces. The air component, coordinated by the 8th and 17th Air Armies, sought to achieve local air superiority against the Luftwaffe, which was increasingly strained by commitments across multiple theaters. The opening moves were shaped by the Soviet breakthrough at Belgorod on 5th of August, and the subsequent capture of Kharkov on 23rd August. These successes forced the German 4th Panzer Army to fall back and exposed the northern flank of Army Group South. The Red Army exploited this by driving south and southeast, aiming to envelop German forces holding the Donetsk basin. Malinovsky's Southwestern Front advanced from the Izium area, while Tolbukhin's Southern Front pressed from the Mius River line. The dual thrust threatened to cut off German forces in the Donbass and trap them east of the Dnieper. For Berlin, the Donbass held significance beyond military geography. It represented one of the most valuable economic zones under German occupation. Coal from the mines fueled locomotives and steel plants, while factories produced machinery and armaments. Losing the region would not only deprive Germany of these resources, but also undermine its ability to sustain prolonged warfare on the Eastern Front. Orders from the German High Command emphasized the necessity of holding the Donbass at all costs. Yet Manstein recognized that rigid defense could lead to encirclement and catastrophe similar to Stalingrad. The contradiction between political directives and military realities defined German decision-making during this phase. On the ground, combat unfolded across a complex terrain of rivers, industrial centers, and rail hubs. The Donetsk River formed a natural defensive line, but Soviet engineers rapidly constructed pontoon bridges to facilitate crossings. Towns such as Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Gorlovka became contested strongpoints, with both sides deploying artillery barrages and close air support. The density of factories, mines, and settlements meant that battles often took place within urban or semi-urban environments, complicating armored maneuver and increasing casualties among civilians who had little opportunity to evacuate. The Luftwaffe attempted to blunt Soviet advances through concentrated bombing raids, targeting bridges, supply depots, and troop concentrations. However, fuel shortages and attrition reduced its effectiveness. Soviet air armies, employing Il-2 ground attack aircraft and Yak and Lay-GG fighters, grew more confident in daylight operations. Control of the skies became increasingly contested, with local superiority shifting according to weather, reinforcements, and availability of fuel. For soldiers on the ground, the presence or absence of friendly aircraft often determined the outcome of engagements. Civilians in the Donbass faced renewed turmoil as front lines shifted. Some towns were evacuated by retreating German forces, often accompanied by forced deportations of able-bodied workers. In other areas, Soviet civilians emerged from hiding or partisan networks to welcome advancing Red Army units. Yet liberation also brought hardships: widespread destruction of housing, shortages of food, and lingering dangers from mines and unexploded ordnance. The prospect of renewed Soviet control carried different meanings for different communities. Some anticipated restoration, others feared reprisals for collaboration under occupation. By the end of August 1943, the Donbass campaign was entering full scale. Soviet forces pressed relentlessly. German units attempted delaying actions, and the industrial heart of eastern Ukraine became the center of one of the war's most intense operational struggles. The outcome would depend on whether the Wehrmacht could execute a controlled withdrawal or whether the Red Army could encircle and annihilate its formations before they reached the Dnieper line. The Soviet plan for the Donbass offensive in late August 1943 reflected both ambition and careful coordination across multiple fronts. The Southwestern Front under General Rodion Malinovsky, numbering approximately 554,000 men, 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 8,000 artillery pieces, was tasked with the northern thrust into the region. To its south, the Southern Front under General Fyodor Tolbukhin fielded around 45,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces. Together, their mission was to converge on the German forces holding the Donetsk basin, split their defensive grouping, and prevent a withdrawal to the Dnieper. The Stavka's expectation was that speed, weight of numbers, and coordination would collapse the German position before it could be reorganized. Opposing them, German Army Group South retained two main groupings. The 1st Panzer Army, commanded by General Oberst Eberhard von Mackensen, defended the northern approaches, while the 6th Army under General Karl Adolf Hollet held the southern sector along the Mius River. In total, the Wehrmacht committed approximately 54,000 men, supported by 900 tanks and assault guns and 5,500 artillery pieces. These forces were spread thin across a front, stretching over 300 kilometers, and many divisions were under strength due to losses at Kursk and the subsequent retreats. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, led by General Otto Desloch, attempted to cover the sector with around 600 operational aircraft, but shortages of fuel and replacement parts limited sustained operations. Or planning within the German High Command revealed sharp contrasts between Hitler's directives and Manstein's operational assessment. Hitler demanded that the Donbass be held for its economic value, ordering fortifications around key industrial centers such as Stalino, modern Donetsk, Makeevka, and Voroshilovgrad, modern Luhansk. Manstein, however, argued for a flexible defense that would conserve forces for a stronger stand along the Dnieper. His preference for tactical withdrawals and elastic defense clashed with Hitler's insistence on static lines, creating delays in response that the Soviets sought to exploit. Soviet operational doctrine in this phase emphasized deep operations. Tank armies, such as the 1st Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Mikhail Katakov, and the 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, were designated for breakthroughs once German lines were breached. Infantry armies, supported by massed artillery barrages, would grind down defenses, followed by mobile exploitation forces to encircle retreating German units. The Red Army's logistics, while improving, faced challenges due to destroyed railways and the need to move supplies across rivers. Nonetheless, Soviet commanders had access to significant reserves and coordinated closely with engineers and partisan formations to maintain momentum. The role of partisans in the Donbass was significant but complex. Networks operating in the coal mining regions and forests disrupted German communications, sabotaged railways, and provided intelligence on troop movements. Their effectiveness varied. Some groups were well organized and supplied, while others operated independently and faced severe reprisals from German security units. Still, their activities added another layer of pressure to the already strained German rear. Propaganda played a central role on both sides. Soviet broadcasts and leaflets highlighted the liberation of Belgorod and Kharkov as symbols of inevitable victory, encouraging both soldiers and civilians to support the offensive. In contrast, German propaganda stressed the importance of defending the Donbas as part of the broader struggle against Bolshevism, and warned soldiers of dire consequences if lines were broken. Among civilians, propaganda had limited effect compared to immediate concerns of survival, food, and the hope, or fear, of regime change depending on the front's advance. The geography of the Donbas added complexity to operational planning. Unlike the open steppe around Kursk, the Donetsk basin contained a dense network of railways, towns, and industrial facilities. Rivers such as the Seversky Donets and Mius provided natural defensive barriers. Urban centers, with their reinforced concrete plants and mining complexes, could be adapted into strong points resistant to artillery and tank assaults. Both sides recognized that fighting in this region would be grueling, with high demands on infantry and engineers. The Soviet command expected heavier resistance in urban areas and adjusted tactics accordingly, preparing for prolonged assaults combined with encirclement operations to bypass the strongest defenses. Intelligence assessments further shaped the coming campaign. Soviet reconnaissance identified the weakened state of several German divisions, including infantry formations reduced to battalion strength. Reports also highlighted shortages of ammunition and fuel in German supply depots. However, German aerial reconnaissance also revealed Soviet force concentrations, allowing Manstein to anticipate the direction of the main blows. This dynamic produced a tense period of maneuver, where both sides sought to mask intentions through deception, feints, and rapid redeployment of reserves. Civilian experiences during the planning phase were marked by uncertainty. Some communities remained under German control, but sensed the approach of Soviet forces. Others, closer to the front, endured evacuations, requisitions, and destruction of infrastructure. German authorities often applied scorched-earth measures, demolishing factories and mines to deny their use to the advancing Red Army. Soviet plans anticipated such destruction and included teams of engineers tasked with rapid repair and reactivation of industrial sites once liberated. For the people of the Donbas, the impending battle promised both the hope of liberation and the near certainty of further devastation. By late August, as Soviet formations completed their preparations, the stage was set for a massive offensive. Both sides understood the stakes. For Germany, the retention of a vital industrial region and the possibility of stabilizing the front. For the Soviet Union, the liberation of lost territory and a decisive step toward the Dnieper and the broader goal of reclaiming Ukraine. The confrontation would soon move from planning to execution, and the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians would be determined in the opening engagements. On the 13th of August 1943, the Soviet Southwestern Front under General Rodion Malinovsky launched its opening moves toward the Donbass. The preparatory artillery barrage, involving more than 2,500 guns, marked the beginning of the assault on German defenses along the Seversky Donets. Infantry of the 57th and 46th Armies advanced behind rolling barrages, forcing crossings over the river under heavy fire. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges while under attack from German artillery and aircraft, sustaining heavy casualties but gradually enabling Soviet armor to cross. The initial gains were limited, but they disrupted German forward positions and compelled the 1st Panzer Army to commit reserves earlier than planned. In the south, the Southern Front under General Fyodor Tolbukhin struck across the Mius River. German forces had fortified this sector since 1942 with multiple trench lines, bunkers, and minefields. The 6th Army under General Karl Adolf Hawlett held the positions with formations including the 6th Army Corps and elements of the 1st Panzer Army's right wing. Soviet troops, spearheaded by the 5th Shock Army and 28th Army, fought through the defenses with support from tanks of the 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps. Gains were measured in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers, but they stretched German forces thin and created vulnerabilities along the flanks. The Luftwaffe attempted to slow the Soviet advance with concentrated airstrikes. Stuka dive bombers and WW2 fighter bombers struck Soviet bridgeheads and pontoon crossings, sinking equipment and inflicting losses. However, Soviet air forces had expanded considerably since 1942. The 8th Air Army provided continuous fighter cover with Yak-9s and LA-5s, while Il-2 ground attack aircraft targeted German artillery and reserves. Air battles over the Donbass were intense, often involving hundreds of aircraft in a single day. Neither side achieved total dominance, but the Soviet capacity to sustain sorties gradually wore down the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. Urban strongpoints presented particular challenges. The towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk became focal points of resistance. German garrisons, supported by field artillery and anti-tank guns, utilized the heavy buildings and industrial structures as improvised fortifications. Soviet infantry fought from street to street, often employing sappers to demolish reinforced positions. Tanks proved less effective in narrow streets and rubble-strewn areas, leading to high casualties on both sides. Civilians trapped within the towns experienced bombardments, shortages of food, and the constant threat of reprisals. German forces sometimes forcibly evacuated populations to clear lines of fire or prevent collaboration with Soviet troops. By mid-August, Soviet advances achieved mixed results. Malinovsky's forces broke through in several sectors, forcing German withdrawals from advanced positions. But Manstein orchestrated counterattacks with elements of the 23rd Panzer Division and 17th Panzer Division. These mobile units struck at exposed Soviet flanks, temporarily halting momentum and inflicting losses. In the south, Tolbukhin's armies secured a shallow bridgehead across the Mius, but at significant cost, with some divisions reduced to half strength after days of fighting. Despite setbacks, Soviet commanders maintained pressure, bringing forward reserves to exploit any German weakness. German command decisions during these engagements reflected increasing strain. Manstein repeatedly requested permission to conduct a general withdrawal from the Donbass to the Dnieper line, arguing that continued defense risked encirclement. Hitler, however, insisted that the Donbass must be held, citing its coal and steel output as essential to the war effort. The contradiction forced German units into rigid defensive battles, often sacrificing mobility. As Soviet pressure mounted, divisions were shifted from one threatened sector to another, creating a constant cycle of reaction that eroded cohesion. Soviet logistics and engineering capabilities were tested heavily in the opening phase. Supply lines stretched across newly liberated areas where railways had been destroyed by retreating Germans. Trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and even civilian carts were employed to move ammunition and fuel to the front. Engineers repaired tracks, restored bridges, and cleared minefields. Despite difficulties, the Red Army demonstrated an ability to sustain large-scale operations, something less feasible during earlier years of the war. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was still uneven, but the overall operational tempo exceeded German capacity to match it. Partisan activity intensified in parallel with the conventional offensive. Sabotage operations against German rail lines in the rear disrupted troop movements and supply deliveries. In some cases, partisans provided intelligence to Soviet commanders about weak points in the German defensive network. German security units attempted countermeasures, conducting sweeps and reprisals, but the sheer scale of Soviet advance made rear area control increasingly difficult. Civilians, often caught between both sides, faced accusations of collaboration or resistance depending on who controlled the territory at a given moment. By late August, Soviet forces had advanced deeper into the Donbass, compelling German units to fall back toward key industrial centers. The fighting shifted increasingly toward Stalino, Makeevka, and Voroshilovgrad, where the German High Command ordered preparations for protracted defense. For the Red Army, the first engagements demonstrated both the difficulty of cracking entrenched positions and the potential for breakthrough when sustained pressure was applied. Losses were heavy, tens of thousands on both sides within weeks, but the strategic situation had shifted. German forces were losing their ability to mount coherent counteroffensives, while Soviet armies pressed forward with growing confidence. The battle for the Donbass was far from concluded, but the momentum was beginning to move decisively against the Wehrmacht. By early September 1943, the Donbass campaign entered a stage of intensification. Soviet forces, having forced the Germans from forward positions along the Seversky Donets and Mius rivers, now pressed deeper toward the industrial centers that formed the heart of the region. The Southwestern Front under General Malinovsky drove from the northwest toward Gorlovka and Stalino, while Tolbukhin's southern front advanced from the south and east, threatening to envelop German formations. The operational goal was clear: split Army Group South's defensive arc, prevent an organized retreat, and cut off units still holding the Donbass before they could withdraw behind the Dnieper. The Wehrmacht faced this crisis with formations that were increasingly overstretched. The 1st Panzer Army, tasked with covering the northern approaches, committed the remnants of the 23rd Panzer Division and the 17th Panzer Division in a series of counterattacks designed to buy time. In the southern sector, the 6th Army deployed infantry corps entrenched around key towns such as Mariupol, Makeevka, and Voroshilovgrad. These formations lacked the strength to mount sustained offensive action, but utilized terrain and fortifications to delay the Soviet advance. German tactical skill in counterattacks occasionally regained ground, yet every gain was temporary, and losses in men and materiel steadily mounted. The Soviet armies expanded their offensive by committing tank and mechanized corps into gaps opened by infantry. The 1st Guards Mechanized Corps advanced toward Artemovsk, while the 4th Guards Tank Corps pushed south from the Izium area. These mobile units, supported by artillery and air attacks, sought to disrupt German withdrawal routes. Heavy fighting erupted around railway junctions, especially Debaltsevo, whose control was essential for moving supplies and reinforcements across the Donbass. German forces fought tenaciously to hold these points, recognizing that their loss would unravel the coherence of the entire front. The air war over the Donbass grew in scale and intensity. Soviet air armies committed hundreds of aircraft daily to support ground offensives. Il-2 Sturmovix conducted massed attacks against German artillery positions and troop columns, while Pe-2 bombers targeted railway hubs and bridges. The Luftwaffe, increasingly constrained, attempted to concentrate its limited strength in sectors of critical importance. Ju-87 Stukas and H's 129 ground attack aircraft inflicted damage on Soviet armored spearheads, but attrition rates were high. Pilots often flew multiple sorties in a single day, with declining maintenance capacity undermining effectiveness. The skies remained contested, but Soviet air activity increasingly disrupted German movements and restricted daylight operations. For the civilian population, the escalation of combat meant heightened hardship. Many towns became battlegrounds, with artillery duels and bombing raids causing destruction of housing, factories, and infrastructure. German authorities continued evacuations of industrial equipment where possible, dismantling machinery and transporting it westward. In some cases, mines were flooded and power plants sabotaged to deny their use to the advancing Soviets. Civilians were sometimes forced to accompany retreating columns as laborers, while others fled into the countryside to escape shelling. Soviet reoccupation was met with both relief and fear. Relief for liberation from German occupation, but fear of reprisals for collaboration, whether voluntary or coerced. Strategically, both sides recognized that the battle had entered a decisive phase. For the Soviet Union, the successful advance toward the Donbass promised to cripple German capacity to maintain a foothold in eastern Ukraine. Stalin pressed his commanders to accelerate operations, emphasizing not only military success, but also the restoration of industrial assets vital to the Soviet war economy. For Germany, the imperative was to withdraw in an orderly fashion, salvaging divisions for the defense of the Dnieper line. Manstein argued repeatedly that retreat, if conducted in time, could preserve combat strength. But Hitler continued to demand prolonged resistance, tying down divisions and positions increasingly untenable. By mid-September, Soviet gains became irreversible. Towns such as Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Barvenkovo fell into Soviet hands after bitter fighting. German units fell back towards Stalino and Voroshilovgrad, their lines compressed and communication routes strained. Encirclement loomed as Soviet tank and mechanized corps pushed to cut escape routes. German divisions executed delaying actions, laying mines, and demolishing bridges to slow pursuit. But the Red Army pressed forward relentlessly. The front, once stable for over a year, was collapsing under the weight of coordinated Soviet offensives. The human toll of these weeks was severe. Estimates suggest that by September 1943, German forces in the Donbass suffered over 1,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet losses were also heavy, reflecting the intensity of urban combat and river crossings, with many rifle divisions reduced to half strength after weeks of continuous action. Despite the attrition, the Soviets retained reserves to feed into the offensive, while German replacements arrived only in small numbers. The disparity in manpower and production capacity was becoming increasingly evident on the battlefield. As the campaign reached its midpoint, the Donbass was on the verge of liberation. German forces faced a choice between holding their ground at the risk of encirclement or retreating to the Dnieper in hopes of establishing a new defensive line. The Soviets, determined to press their advantage, prepared for further thrusts into the industrial heart of the basin. The outcome of the coming weeks would determine not only control of the Donbass, but also the shape of operations in Ukraine for the remainder of 1943. By late September 1943, the battle for the Donbass reached its peak. The Soviet Southwestern and Southern fronts pressed on a broad front, driving deep into the basin's core industrial areas. The operational tempo was relentless. Daily artillery barrages, mass tank assaults, and airstrikes created an atmosphere of constant combat. German Army Group South, weakened by earlier losses, struggled to hold the sprawling urban and industrial strongholds that defined the region. The cities of Stalino, Makeevka, and Voroshilovgrad became the central objectives as their factories, mines, and transport links made them indispensable to both armies. The Soviet command concentrated overwhelming force in these sectors. Malinovsky's 6th Army advanced toward Gorlovka and Stalino, while Tolbukhin's 5th Shock Army and 2nd Guards Army moved on Voroshilovgrad. Together, they fielded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by more than 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Artillery density reached up to 200 guns per kilometer on critical sectors, preparing the way for infantry and armor to break through. The Red Army's growing proficiency in combined arms tactics became evident, with artillery barrages closely synchronized with infantry advances, and tank formations exploiting breakthroughs with greater coordination than in previous years. German defenses in the Donbass were formidable on paper, but brittle in practice. Hitler's insistence on holding the region meant that divisions were ordered to defend every major industrial site, regardless of operational risk. Units such as the 17th Panzer Division, the 23rd Panzer Division, and remnants of several infantry corps were tied down in urban battles where their mobility could not be fully employed. German commanders used factories, slag heaps, and mine shafts as defensive positions, creating networks of bunkers and strong points. These positions inflicted significant casualties on attacking Soviet forces, but the Wehrmacht lacked the reserves to counterattack effectively once breakthroughs occurred. Urban combat was fierce and destructive. In Gorlovka, Soviet assault groups armed with submachine guns, flamethrowers, and satchel charges cleared German positions building by building. Tanks provided direct fire support, often at point-blank range. In Stalino, the industrial district became a battlefield, with German defenders using blast furnaces and concrete structures as makeshift fortresses. Civilian populations, numbering in the tens of thousands, were caught in the crossfire. Many sought shelter in basements, while others fled into the countryside under artillery fire. Both advancing Soviet forces and retreating Germans imposed requisitions, further straining local survival. The air war intensified above the Donbass. The Soviet 8th and 17th Air Armies launched continuous sorties against German rail lines, bridges, and troop concentrations. The Il-2 flying tanks proved particularly effective against German artillery and infantry columns, while Yak and La-5 fighters challenged Luftwaffe air cover. German pilots flying FW-190s and Bf-109s retained tactical superiority in some encounters, but attrition and fuel shortages eroded their capacity. Increasingly, German aircraft were concentrated only over critical sectors, leaving large areas exposed to Soviet bombing. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest the air across the entire front allowed the Red Army to sustain pressure with fewer disruptions. Civilian suffering during this stage was acute. As German forces withdrew, they implemented scorched-earth policies, demolishing mines, power plants, and railway infrastructure. Thousands of civilians were deported westward for forced labor, while others were executed on suspicion of aiding partisans. Soviet engineers advancing behind the front faced enormous challenges, restoring electricity, clearing mines, and repairing railways to bring supplies forward. The destruction of industrial capacity was widespread, but the Soviet leadership prioritized the symbolic value of liberation as much as immediate production. Restoring the Donbass would take years, but reclaiming it from German control was a major political and military objective. German operational difficulties mounted daily. Manstein pressed once more for permission to withdraw toward the Dnieper line, arguing that continued resistance in the Donbass risked encirclement and collapse. Hitler reluctantly conceded limited withdrawals, but only after significant losses had been sustained. The Sixth Army, in particular, faced the prospect of being trapped as Soviet mechanized forces pushed to sever its lines of retreat. Delaying actions by German rearguards, using mines and demolitions, slowed the Soviet advance but could not halt it entirely. The Wehrmacht's position became increasingly untenable, with divisions fighting at fractions of their authorized strength. By the end of September, Soviet forces had broken into the industrial heartland. Voroshilovgrad fell after heavy fighting, and Soviet troops closed in on Stalino and Makeevka. The pace of operations left little respite for either side, but the imbalance in resources and manpower was clear. The Red Army had achieved both operational and strategic momentum, while the Wehrmacht faced a choice between annihilation in place or retreat across the Dnieper. The peak of the Donbas campaign had arrived, and its outcome would determine the future course of the war in Ukraine. In early October 1943, the Wehrmacht entered a phase of desperate resistance and forced adaptation. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, faced the grim reality that its forces could no longer hold the Donbass. The Soviet advance had been relentless, and the possibility of encirclement was growing with each passing day. German divisions that once numbered 12,000 to 15,000 men often fielded no more than 4,000 to 6,000, many of them exhausted after months of continuous combat. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of panzer units, while artillery ammunition stocks dwindled to less than half of operational requirements. Under such conditions, the Wehrmacht's strategy shifted toward delaying actions, trading space for time to enable a retreat toward the Dnieper line. German defensive adaptation relied heavily on the geography of the region. The basin's rivers, slag heaps, and mining infrastructure offered natural and improvised defensive barriers. Rearguard units constructed strongpoints in industrial complexes, forcing Soviet troops into costly assaults. Mobile detachments conducted spoiling attacks on advancing Soviet spearheads, attempting to slow their progress and cover the withdrawal of heavier equipment. Engineers mined roads and bridges, while demolition teams systematically destroyed railway junctions to deny their use to the enemy. Despite these efforts, the sheer scale of the Soviet offensive made it impossible to maintain a coherent defense across the entire front. The Red Army, meanwhile, displayed its capacity for sustained offensive operations. Malinovsky's Southwestern Front and Tolbukhin's Southern Front coordinated their advances with increasing efficiency. Soviet commanders rotated depleted rifle divisions out of the front lines while committing fresh reserves from second-echelon armies. Tank and mechanized corps were pushed forward to exploit gaps in the German lines, often operating in concert with cavalry mechanized groups that penetrated into the rear. Supply remained a constant challenge, as railways had been destroyed or sabotaged, but Soviet logistical units expanded truck columns and improvised ferry crossings to sustain momentum. The Red Army's adaptability contrasted with the German struggle to preserve cohesion. Resistance came not only from regular German formations, but also from ad hoc Kampfgruppen assembled from remnants of shattered units. These groups, often commanded by experienced officers, staged localized counterattacks to blunt Soviet thrusts. At Debaltsevo, for example, a combination of panzer battalions and infantry remnants temporarily halted Soviet progress, inflicting losses on advancing tank brigades. Yet, such efforts consumed precious reserves and rarely altered the overall trajectory of the campaign. Soviet pressure quickly resumed, backed by overwhelming artillery and air support. Partisan activity in the Donbass also intensified as German forces retreated. Local fighters, familiar with the terrain and infrastructure, disrupted rear area movements by cutting communications and ambushing small columns. Coordination between partisans and the Red Army improved, with intelligence on German withdrawal routes aiding Soviet armored thrusts. German security divisions, already overstretched, lacked the capacity to suppress these activities effectively. The erosion of rear area control further undermined the Wehrmacht's ability to organize a structured retreat. For civilians, the shifting front lines brought renewed uncertainty. Those who had endured German occupation for more than a year now faced the chaos of combat in their towns and villages. Some were forcibly evacuated by retreating German units, while others attempted to assist the Red Army in repairing railways and bridges. The transition was rarely smooth. Accusations of collaboration, looting during retreats, and reprisals against suspected partisan sympathizers created a climate of fear. Entire communities were displaced as fighting engulfed urban centers, leaving long-term scars on the social fabric of the region. The Luftwaffe's role during this period was primarily defensive. With fuel and aircraft numbers diminished, its missions focused on covering retreating columns and striking Soviet concentrations at critical junctures. However, Soviet air armies flew hundreds of sorties daily, attacking German transport hubs and encirclement escape routes. The Il-2 ground attack aircraft proved especially effective against German rear guards, while Soviet fighters increasingly dominated the skies. German aircraft could contest air superiority only in narrow sectors, leaving much of the front exposed to Soviet bombing. By mid-October, the Red Army had liberated most of the Donbas. Voroshilovgrad, Stalino, and Makeevka were in Soviet hands, though devastated by combat and deliberate German demolition. The rapid pace of the advance left infrastructure in ruins, mines flooded, rail lines torn up, and factories stripped of machinery. For the Soviet leadership, the priority was both symbolic and strategic, demonstrating the ability to reclaim vital territory and preparing for the next stage of operations across the Dnieper. Stalin emphasized the liberation of the Donbass in public announcements, framing it as a milestone on the road to the recovery of all Ukraine. German withdrawals continued under pressure. Army Group South attempted to consolidate along the Dnieper, establishing defensive lines with what remained of its divisions. Manstein argued that only by saving his troops from encirclement could he hope to rebuild an effective front. The retreat, however, was costly. Equipment abandoned, thousands of men cut off and captured, and morale shaken by the relentless Soviet advance. The Wehrmacht's reputation for tactical skill allowed some units to escape destruction, but the strategic loss of the Donbass was irreversible. As October closed, the battle entered its final stage. The Donbass, long held as one of the most valuable occupied regions of the Soviet Union, had been reclaimed at enormous cost. The Wehrmacht's withdrawal opened the path to the Dnieper, where new battles loomed. For soldiers and civilians alike, the weeks of resistance and adaptation had left deep scars, setting the stage for the final Soviet push toward the western bank of Ukraine. The decisive turning point in the Donbass campaign came in the second half of October 1943. By this stage, the Soviet Southwestern and Southern fronts had advanced across most of the region, compressing German Army Group South into a narrowing corridor leading toward the Dnieper. What had begun in August as a methodical offensive had now become a full-scale pursuit. The Red Army sought to prevent an orderly German withdrawal, aiming instead to encircle and annihilate as many formations as possible before they could cross the river. The struggle shifted from static urban battles to fast-moving operations across open steppe and shattered industrial landscapes. German forces, though heavily weakened, attempted to execute a fighting retreat. The 1st Panzer Army and 6th Army coordinated successive lines of defense, withdrawing by night and counterattacking by day to cover the movement of rear units. Panzer divisions, despite operating with fewer than 50 operational tanks in some cases, remained effective in localized actions. At Krasnoarmeyskoye and near the Kalmius River, German armored groups struck Soviet spearheads, momentarily halting advances and buying time for infantry columns and supply trains. Yet these delaying actions came at a high cost, consuming fuel and further exhausting divisions already worn down by months of combat. The Red Army intensified efforts to cut off escape routes. Tank and mechanized corps, such as the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps and the 23rd Tank Corps, pushed rapidly southward and westward, seeking to sever German communications and block crossings over the Dnieper. Cavalry mechanized groups, a Soviet innovation combining mounted troops with motorized elements, operated on the flanks, raiding deep into German rear areas. At Debaltsevo, one of the most important railway junctions, Soviet forces succeeded in severing key lines, isolating several German units temporarily. Although some broke out through counterattacks, others were forced to abandon heavy equipment and retreat in disarray. Air power played a decisive role in this turning point. The Soviet 8th and 17th Air Armies maintained unrelenting pressure on German withdrawal columns. Bridges, ferries, and railway stations were bombed repeatedly, causing traffic jams that exposed troops to further attacks. Il-2 Sturmovix strafed marching columns, while PE-2 bombers targeted staging areas near the river. The Luftwaffe, facing shortages of both fuel and trained pilots, was unable to respond on a comparable scale. German air units concentrated only on shielding the most critical crossings, leaving other sectors virtually unprotected. The imbalance in the air further accelerated the collapse of German control. The situation of civilians during this phase grew increasingly desperate. Entire towns were reduced to rubble by artillery and air bombardment. German forces, following scorched-earth orders, destroyed coal mines, flooded shafts, and demolished factories to prevent their immediate use by the Soviets. Power stations and railway depots were blown up, leaving local populations without electricity or transport. Civilians were often caught in retreating columns, either forcibly evacuated or fleeing bombardments. Many faced hunger, as food supplies were requisitioned by both retreating German troops and advancing Soviet forces. For the local population, liberation was accompanied by devastation, displacement, and uncertainty. On the Soviet side, the advance was celebrated as a major step toward reclaiming Ukraine, yet it came with enormous sacrifices. Rifle divisions were reduced to half or even a third of their authorized strength after weeks of fighting. Casualty lists grew daily, and the strain of constant offensive operations weighed heavily on soldiers. Nonetheless, morale remained high, fueled by the visible collapse of German defenses and the symbolic liberation of cities long under occupation. For commanders such as Malinovsky and Tolbukhin, the priority was to maintain momentum and prevent the Wehrmacht from regrouping on the Dnieper. By late October, Stalino, modern Donetsk, Makeevka, and Voroshilovgrad had been fully secured. The Red Army planted its banners over destroyed factories and coal mines, signaling the recovery of one of the Soviet Union's most vital industrial regions. While much of the infrastructure lay in ruins, the psychological and political impact was immense. Stalin and the Stavka presented the liberation of the Donbass as proof that the tide of war had irreversibly turned. The Soviet press emphasized not only the scale of the victory, but also the return of workers and miners who had survived under occupation, portraying them as symbols of resilience and renewal. For the Wehrmacht, the turning point was acknowledged in grim assessments sent to Berlin. Reports indicated that entire divisions had been reduced to Kampfgruppen, numbering only a few thousand men. Equipment losses were heavy, and replacement flows could not keep pace. Manstein urged a rapid retreat across the Dnieper, warning that failure to do so risked the destruction of Army Group South. Hitler, facing the reality of military collapse, reluctantly approved a general withdrawal, though he continued to insist that certain bridgeheads on the river be held to the last. The decision came too late for many units, which were caught by Soviet encirclements or overwhelmed during rearguard actions. By the end of October 1943, the Donbas campaign had reached its decisive conclusion. The Red Army stood victorious, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, and the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine had returned to Soviet hands. The turning point had been achieved not through a single battle, but through a sustained series of offensives that exhausted German strength, overwhelmed defensive positions, and denied the enemy the ability to regroup. The stage was set for the next phase of the Eastern Front struggle, the battle for the Dnieper, where both armies would soon contest the vast river line that now marked the new front of the war. By early November 1943, the battle for the Donbas transitioned into its final stage, the German withdrawal and the consolidation of Soviet control. Army Group South, battered by continuous Soviet offensives, attempted to execute an organized retreat toward the Dnieper. The retreat was not a single, orderly maneuver, but rather a patchwork of hurried movements, desperate rearguard battles, and broken units struggling to escape encirclement. For the Wehrmacht, the overriding objective was survival, preserving as much manpower and equipment as possible for the coming defense along the river. For the Red Army, the aim was to press relentlessly, to capture strategic crossings, and to ensure that German forces could not regroup effectively west of the Donbass. The withdrawal was carried out under extraordinary pressure. German units often had to abandon heavy equipment, fuel depots, and artillery pieces that could not be transported in time. Railway lines had been destroyed or were under constant Soviet air attack, forcing columns onto poorly maintained roads. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers, with tanks, wagons, and horse-drawn carts intermingled, vulnerable to aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe concentrated what remained of its strength on covering these withdrawal routes, but Soviet air superiority made protection partial at best. Continuous bombing raids turned some escape corridors into scenes of devastation, with burning vehicles blocking the roads and stragglers left behind. Soviet pursuit was intense. Mechanized corps advanced in rapid thrusts, attempting to overtake German rearguards and cut off pockets of resistance. Cavalry mechanized groups raided deep into the flanks, seizing bridges and road junctions before the Germans could demolish them. Artillery units were moved forward with remarkable speed to support the advancing infantry. The Soviet command was determined not to allow the Wehrmacht time to regroup, fully aware that the Dnieper line could become a formidable obstacle if the Germans managed to fortify it. Reports from Soviet frontline commanders emphasized the importance of momentum. Speed could prevent the creation of another static front like the Mius or the Seversky Donets. Urban centers in the Donbas changed hands one after another as German forces evacuated and Soviet troops pressed in. Mariupol fell after a series of sharp clashes in the port area, where German naval units had attempted to evacuate equipment. Voroshilovgrad, and Stalino were already secured, but fighting continued in satellite towns where German rearguards sought to delay the Soviet advance. Each urban battle added to the toll of destruction. Industrial plants were stripped, mines flooded, and power stations wrecked by German demolition teams. For Soviet engineers, restoring even minimal production would take months. Yet the political weight of liberation overshadowed the immediate material losses. The civilian population bore the brunt of the final phase. Forced evacuations remained common. Tens of thousands of civilians were marched westward by German units to serve as laborers. Others were left behind in devastated towns, facing shortages of food and shelter. Soviet authorities moved quickly to re-establish administrative control, deploying NKVD units and party officials alongside advancing troops. While some civilians welcomed liberation, others feared reprisals for perceived collaboration during the occupation. In many cases, individuals had been compelled to work for German authorities under duress and now faced suspicion or arrest. The social fabric of the region was torn by years of occupation, resistance, and shifting front lines. Casualties mounted on both sides. German losses during the withdrawal were severe, tens of thousands captured in encirclements, along with heavy equipment abandoned or destroyed. Soviet forces also paid a high price, particularly in armored units that had driven deep into enemy territory without full logistical support. Rifle divisions that began the offensive with 1,000 men often counted fewer than 4,000 by the end of the campaign. Hospitals across the liberated areas filled with wounded, while the logistical burden of evacuating them strained Soviet supply networks. Yet, despite the scale of sacrifice, the overall outcome left no doubt. The Wehrmacht had been forced to abandon one of the most important regions it had occupied since 1941. Politically, the liberation of the Donbas was presented by the Soviet leadership as a decisive victory. Stalin issued public statements praising the efforts of the Red Army and highlighting the symbolic importance of regaining the industrial heartland. The victory was portrayed not only as a military success, but also as proof of the Soviet Union's ability to recover and expand its war economy. In Berlin, the loss was acknowledged as a grave blow. Reports from the German High Command admitted that the collapse of the Donbass severely undermined both morale and supply, while the retreat to the Dnieper exposed vast stretches of occupied territory to Soviet offensives. By mid-November 1943, the last organized German formations had crossed the Dnieper, destroying bridges behind them. The front line stabilized temporarily along the river, where both sides prepared for the next phase of the war. The Red Army consolidated control over the Donbass, clearing mines, restoring rail links, and deploying security forces to stabilize the rear. Army Group South, though battered, remained intact enough to form a defensive line on the western bank, delaying the Soviet advance into central Ukraine. The Donbass campaign had ended with a decisive Soviet victory, but the struggle for Ukraine was far from over. The river barrier now loomed as the next great challenge, one that would determine the pace of the war in 1944. The liberation of the Donbass in the autumn of 1943 carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. Strategically, the campaign demonstrated that the Soviet Union had seized the permanent initiative on the Eastern Front. The German failure at Kursk, followed by the loss of the Donetsk basin, confirmed that the Wehrmacht could no longer mount large-scale offensives capable of regaining lost ground. The Donbass, with its coal mines, metallurgical plants, and chemical industries, had been among the most prized economic possessions of the Third Reich in the occupied Soviet Union. Its loss deprived Germany of millions of tons of coal and iron ore, reducing the capacity of its war economy at a time when Allied strategic bombing and the demands of multiple fronts were already stretching resources thin. For the Soviet Union, the return of the Donbass was as much symbolic as it was practical. While the industrial infrastructure was devastated, mines flooded, plants dismantled, and railways destroyed, Moscow emphasized that the soil and resources had been regained. Soviet engineers and administrators were immediately dispatched to begin restoration, often working under dangerous conditions with unexploded ordnance scattered across mining shafts and factory floors. Recovery would take years, but the mere possession of the region represented a political triumph. Stalin used the victory to strengthen his domestic position, portraying the campaign as proof of the Red Army's growing superiority and of the inevitability of eventual Soviet victory in the wider war. The campaign also reshaped the military balance in Ukraine. With the Donbas secured, Soviet forces stood on the Dnieper, facing German army groups south across the river. This line, though formidable, could not mask the fact that the Wehrmacht had suffered another strategic defeat. The Red Army had proven its ability to coordinate multi-front operations, combining infantry, armor, artillery, air power, and partisans in sustained offensives. Commanders such as Malinovsky and Tolbukhin gained prominence for their roles, and their operations became models for subsequent Soviet offensives in 1944. The lessons of the Donbas campaign, emphasizing deep operations, rapid exploitation, and logistical resilience, would be applied on an even larger scale during the later battles for the right bank Ukraine and the push toward the Balkans. The human dimension of the battle was equally significant. The civilian population of the Donbass had endured 2 years of German occupation, characterized by forced labor, deportations, and reprisals. Liberation did not bring immediate relief. Families returned to destroyed homes, communities were fragmented, and shortages of food, fuel, and medicine persisted. Soviet authorities reasserted control through NKVD units, party officials, and local Soviets, which carried out both reconstruction and investigations into alleged collaboration. Some civilians who had worked under German occupation were arrested, while others were celebrated as partisans or underground activists. The war left deep social scars, but it also reinforced the Soviet government's determination to integrate the region fully into the post-war order. From the German perspective, the loss of the Donbass was a severe blow not only militarily, but psychologically. Propaganda had long emphasized the importance of Ukraine as the breadbasket and resource base for the Reich. The retreat undermined confidence in the promise of victory in the east and contributed to growing disillusionment among German troops and civilians alike. Manstein and other commanders blamed Hitler's insistence on static defense for the scale of losses, arguing that a timely withdrawal might have preserved more divisions for the Dnieper line. The internal tensions between military pragmatism and political directives revealed the fractures within the German war effort. In the wider context of the Second World War, the outcome of the Donbass campaign aligned with developments elsewhere in 1943. In the Mediterranean, Italy had surrendered, and the Allies had landed on the mainland. In the Atlantic, U-boat losses were mounting, and German naval strategy was faltering. On the Eastern Front, the cumulative effect of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Donbass meant that the Axis powers could no longer hope to regain the strategic initiative. The war had entered a phase of sustained Allied offensives, with Germany increasingly on the defensive on all fronts. The legacy of the Donbass battle remained profound long after 1943. For the Soviet Union, it marked a key stage in the liberation of Ukraine and a demonstration of operational maturity. For Germany, it was another step in the long retreat westward, eroding both military capacity and political credibility. The destruction of the region's infrastructure highlighted the immense costs of modern warfare, where industrial and civilian targets were inseparably tied to the battlefield. In Soviet memory, the battle was commemorated as part of the Great Turning of the Tide, while in German accounts, it symbolized the futility of clinging to untenable positions under rigid political orders. Ultimately, the Battle of the Donbass illustrated the interconnectedness of military, economic, and human dimensions of total war. It was not a single clash, but a prolonged campaign of offensives, counterattacks, withdrawals, and devastation, fought over a territory whose significance reached beyond its borders. Its outcome confirmed that the Red Army had moved from defense to decisive offensive operations, reshaping the course of the war in Eastern Europe. By the close of 1943, the Dnieper line stood as the next battlefield, but the liberation of the Donbass had already ensured that the balance of the Eastern Front would never again shift in Germany's favor.